Good morning, bonjour. My name is Jim Finkel. Several of you have met me, and if I haven't met you yet, I hope to by the end of this evening. Really privileged to talk to you for 15 minutes or so today. I've never given exactly a TED Talk. I might have to refer to my notes once or twice. There's a fair amount of content in there, and apologize if my talk's a little bit homespun. I find that parables work very well in my speeches, and I'll probably make a few references to some stories that will have to be kept confidential among us. Anyway, my talk is completely unresearched and wildly subjective, and it really, about me, is trying to share with you what I think is the most basic truth about wine appreciation that would normally be completely disrespected if I said it to a serious wine audience, which is I simply love I simply love wine, and wine makes me feel great when I drink it. Period. The end. So I'm constantly fighting with the tension between intellectual pleasure and hedonistic pleasure in wine. And my talk today is going to approach both those pleasures through a set of processes, both a Geo-Sensory process, kind of going back to some regressive basics and thinking about wine, and a psychosensory process, which is thinking about wine in a kind of a limited context, putting some of the baggage that we bring to tastings aside, and letting the pleasure of wine, the sensory pleasure of wine, be part of our wine appreciation. So my first exposure to wine wasn't at home. It was through a serendipitous experience when I was a student in Paris with a winemaker, with a wine shop that I stumbled on the first night I was there, a man named Jean-Baptiste Besse. And Mr. Besse, over here, your quintessential French wine merchant, refused to sell me a bottle of 1947 Moet Chandon that at the time cost 200 francs or $40, because he said I was a student and I couldn't afford that kind of bottle, even though I was standing there with 200 francs in my hand saying, come on. So we spent hours debating why I didn't deserve to buy that wine. And the shop reminded me of my father's store that I grew up working in, except it was a mess. There was no inventory, there was no cash register, half the bottles didn't have labels. So I offered to work for him for free every afternoon, because I had every afternoon free for a couple months. And he hired me on, and I ended up doing a lot of the inventory and some basic accounting and reorganizing the cellar for him. And he would pay me by giving me 2 bottles of wine every day and telling me to take them home and come back with my roommate and drink them and tell me which one I like better and why. And as soon as I started using any words that were kind of fancy, I said, no, just why? Just is it better than the last one? And just one word, why is it better? Why did you like it? And he made me keep it very, very simple. And he rewarded me if I picked a wine that he deemed better, he would give me a slightly better wine the next time. And ultimately, I kept some notes. He gave me a whole tour of France through the tasting. But Besse, as you can tell from the picture on the left, he wasn't just intellectual. He was obviously a hedonist as well. You can tell that smile and that arm around that girl, that he understood the various pleasures that wine brings us, and he imparted those on me as well. He didn't impart the girl upon me, but he imparted the understanding. So these questions about that I love wine and I love how it makes me feel would normally lead somebody who's thoughtful to ask other questions, such as, well, how much do you like wine, and why do you like wine, and how good does it make you feel? Let's take it to another level. And I find all those questions ridiculous, because if you have to measure how much you like wine, or you have to actually start thinking about reconsidering why you like wine, you've got major problems. You either just have to love it flat out, or find some other thing you like to spend your time with. So what does all my banter here mean to you? Well, what it really means is, can we put some of the thoughts we have and our learned knowledge about wine a little bit to the side, not saying that we shouldn't try hard to learn about wine and study wine, but can we put them to the side in a different way to try to appreciate wine in a more basic intellectual sense and more of a physical sense as well. So I feel it's totally appropriate, for example, in that context to just have wine commentary such as, I love this wine, it smells great, it tastes great, and it makes me feel great, and I don't really need to say anything more to my tasting group. Now, I used to go to tastings in New York, competitive tastings that were set up where everybody had to bring 2 bottles of the same wine. There'd be a theme, and you had to get them in the restaurant in the afternoon. You'd sit down, there'd be 20 or 25 wines in front of you, and all you had to do was rank them best to worst. No commentary, no vocabulary, no guessing what the wine was. And then we'd go around the room and we'd vote all the wines, and whoever, when it was all tallied up, brought the wine that was voted worst had to buy dinner for the 25 people. Now, that was a high-pressure situation, and I tied for last once, but it was an interesting way of thinking about tasting wine because all it asked us to do was just say which wine do we like best, and next best, and so on. So that also kind of led me to believe that when we had to dumb it down so much but still be thoughtful about what we were bringing, that there's some other way to look at wine. Now, we have a lot of ways that we try to analyze wine. We have the wine grid that the sommeliers use. We have matrices that people use that take all the basic fields of wine and put them in some kind of organized context for us to assess wine. And I'm not saying that that's wrong and that's bad. And I'm not even saying that more words, the AC Noble wine wheel, is a bad thing. I think it's helpful. At least it helps me categorize and think about what I'm tasting, but it doesn't really, at the end of the day, lead me to say, I think this wine is better than another wine that I'm tasting. That's just the most basic thing. And sometimes I think it can confuse or distract us from that. So I like, for example, the Clive Coates way of describing wine. He just basically has 3 terms: fine, very fine, or very fine indeed. And what's the matter with that? In fact, in my wine tasting notes, I write a few words down, but I use the Michelin star system, and I just have 1, 2, or 3 stars. I've kind of cheated a little bit. I have half stars now in between, but it seems to be a simpler way for me to really just rank the wines, and at the end of the day, find out what I like best. Another way we can talk about wine is what a little bit with Roger did yesterday. Look at lots of data and weather data in particular, and say that a wine's better because a vintage is better. And here's Ashenfelter, Professor Orly Ashenfelter, who in 1990 created a lot of controversy by saying that you could just simply rank wine by the harvest conditions of weather. I don't totally agree with that. Again, I think you have to taste wine and you have to rank it yourself, and you have to put a lot of the baggage, even the stuff we learned yesterday, I think you've got to put it to some extent aside, not throw it away, but put it on the side and let your own sensory perception control. Now, here's the first set of baggage that I think we bring to the table. And before I get into prices, we bring to the table our learned knowledge. And what is our learned knowledge? It's the reputation of the chateau. It's the perhaps personal knowledge of the winemaker. And I think I have some, I know Thomas Duroux pretty well. Does that make me appreciate Palmer better, or does it actually influence me and bias me to liking Palmer better? Or do I know that a wine comes from a great cellar or a great chateau? I think all these externalities can really create bias in us that makes it harder for us to fairly evaluate wine. Does the provenance of a wine matter? Does it matter if it came from Berry Brothers or from that shelf in that kind of low-end wine bar? I have an amazing thing that happened. I had a professor who was an antique dealer on the side, and he lived in Houston, and he was at a garage sale and found a bottle of wine wrapped up in saran wrap, and he bought it for $5. It was full. It was a bottle of 1928 Leo Velasquez. And he bought it for me as a gift because he thought I'd like the label. It had been sitting in the garage, the man told him, unair-conditioned garage in Houston, Texas, for something like 7 to 9 years. So I threw it in my cellar. I never thought much more about it. And then I had some friends over one night, and yes, we had a fair amount to drink already. And I thought, this would be a great moment to take that bottle of wine out. Not to fool anybody, but if it's great, we'll all remember having a great 1928 Leo Velasquez. It was, at that time, probably the oldest bottle I had in my cellar. This was 20-some years ago. And if it's terrible, we'll all forget about it. Well, we opened it, and it was fantastic. And then I told one of the people, who actually at the time was the maître of the Commanderie de Bordeaux, New York, what the provenance was, and he immediately turned his opinion around and said, I knew there was problems with that bottle. So again, now is that his ego talking, or is that something that, more representative of the bias we bring to the table? We've got Parker scores. I mean, how bias influencing our Parker scores? But again, going back, what we have is, the price of wine, and that's probably the deepest and heaviest of the learned knowledge externalities. We just can't avoid thinking that an expensive bottle is a better bottle of wine than a cheaper bottle, and I think we need to work hard to put some of that aside. This is the thing that drives me crazy. This is Benjamin Wallace's TED Talk that I watched in preparation for this, called The Price of Happiness. He went out on a mission to taste the most expensive wines in the world, which sounds like a really fun project as long as someone else is paying for it. But he entitled The Price of Happiness. Why does a really expensive bottle have, by definition, make us happy? It's a troubling concept to me. So going back to my basic 3-star method, or just picking the best wine out of the 25 of the wine competition, I tend to find at the end of the day, when we all sit down, we all have something we call Wotan, or the wine of the night, right? I threw an O in there because there's our friend Odin from the Wagnerian ring cycle. But really, I think at the end of the day, when I think about all the wine notes I've kept in my life, and I have folders and folders and folders of them, what am I going to do? I don't want to put out another book that says, here's all the great wine tastings I went to, and here's all the wines we drank. I think I'd like to put out a book saying, here was the wine of the night, here was the best wine I tasted from each one, without even any explanation. I might list everything else we had just for perspective, but I think there's nothing the matter with that. So that's our learned knowledge. That's one compartment in the baggage we bring to a tasting. The other compartment, I think, is even more difficult. It's what I call our survival instinct to either sound intelligent or not sound stupid, and certainly not to offend anybody. I mean, who wants to sit around and say something that these gentlemen in that faded picture on the left would be offended by? And who would want to say something that would offend the wife if it was a wine that she thought was special but wasn't that good? Who would want to offend this nice date that you might have on a date? Who would want to ruin her evening by saying, I don't think this wine that I ordered from the list is that good? Who would not just want to keep everybody happy? And I've had experiences like that. I've had dinners where I've ordered wines that don't make me happy, and I've decided consciously the other people at the table really, it's not as important to them, and I'll ruin the evening either for them, or they'll just be concerned that I'm not having a good time because I have a problem with the wine that we're drinking. And I think this is another part of the baggage we bring to a tasting is what can we say, or what can't we say? And it reminds me of an old joke that I love, which is a nasty old guy dies and nobody in the community liked him, and the rabbi is there giving the eulogy in the cemetery on a cold winter day, and after the eulogy he says, now in the tradition of our congregation, somebody here has to say something nice about the deceased. And 5 minutes goes by, 10 minutes goes by, 15 minutes goes by, nobody says anything. The rabbi's imploring them, he's clearing his voice, he's hustling people to say, we got to get out of this freezing cemetery. And finally, a little man in the back puts his hand up, and the rabbi's excited to hear something nice, and the little man says, his brother was worse. And is that the best thing I can say that's diplomatic about a wine? Well, I've had worse than that. So I mean, it's very, very hard to comment on wine in a way that's honest and open and doesn't offend people. So the thing that bothers me even more in this kind of second compartment of the baggage we bring to wine tasting is the person that says, don't waste wine on me, I can't appreciate it. This thing drives me crazy, and I always say to them, well, who taught you how to kiss? No, not that kiss. And we trashed the tongue thing yesterday, so I'm not going to get too much of the tongue thing. But, who taught you how to kiss? Well, nobody teaches anybody how to kiss. You learn from experience. And as soon as I ask that to somebody, it's a little bit, disquieting for somebody. But basically what I'm trying to say to them is experiential-based learning is the best way to learn. You're not going to read about it in a book. Nobody's going to teach it to you. You're just going to get it from experience. And this is kind of my, keep it simple, the KISS rule. as part of the whole thing. And I find people who say, don't waste wine on me, they're really possibly sending us another message. They're being either passive-aggressive or self-effacing, or they just are trying to avoid embarrassment, because wine does come with this heavy baggage of learned knowledge that people who haven't made the effort, don't feel they are worthy of knowing about wine, carry with them. So I think all these things are quite troubling. But now I've gone off on a pretty far tangent about the basics I want to talk about. So the basics are the concept, one of the three concepts today, Geo-Sensory wine tasting. And here we are looking at the middle-age Compagnie des Gourmets Piqueurs du Vin, which has been around for almost 700 years. They were specialist wine brokers who were very accomplished, and their entire mission was just to determine terroir and rank wine based on terroir. It was not what we learned later, which was the 1855 classification of ranking wine by its value, which was, as we know, what led to the 1855 classification. So these gentlemen could basically determine wines that came from one clos or another in Burgundy in a very, very simplified manner. And I think their tasting was largely unadulterated and uninfluenced by presumably commercial interests, et cetera. They certainly weren't the owners of any of the vineyards, from what I understand. And you also had the monks of Burgundy who were determining the quality of wine through trial and error, again, through experiential-based learning. And I think that is something we have to just keep in mind as foundations for our learning. Now, this concept of terroir, I think, has gotten wildly overblown and too dominant in the search for quality of wine. And there are what I call anti-terroirists out there. There are scientists who say that forget about the rocks that are in the vineyards. They can't physically influence the vines or the roots, and therefore they can't physically influence the grapes, and therefore you can't taste it in the wine. Now, I think a more evolved point is that actually microbes in subsoils that are pushed around by the rocks and are living can get into the water and into the vine, and that has been pretty well determined. But there is a huge debate still going on about terroir as to whether geologic structures of soils are really influential or not. We clearly know, though, that climate is influential, and sun, wind, cold, heat, all that does affect our concepts of terroir, our taste of place, and as well these evolving concepts of minerality in wine. The problem is that man, and presumably women, have influenced the soils by putting up to 200 different kind of chemicals or components, pesticides, herbicides, weed killers over the years, and they're not entirely out of the soils. We all know about biodynamic and organic winemakers, but there's still a lot of that out there to control production because it's a huge economic issue for winemakers. And that makes us, I think, often feel that human intervention in winemaking is kind of an evil thing. And you hear lots of winemakers saying, I'm just a transmission agent of nature, or I have a very, very light touch. And I think that's fine. To me, the best winemaking tool is probably what a winemaker once said to me is, my best winemaking tool in my cellar is a chair. Whenever I want to fuss around and do something to the wine, I stop and I go sit down. And that's okay. That makes sense to me. But I think, and teasing out energy and natural flavors in wine is a great thing. But I think these concepts of terroir and light touch winemaking ignore a very, very basic part of winemaking, which is in fact blending. And I brought up blending very purposely in my last question for Roger yesterday, because I think terroir and blending go hand in hand and are equally as important, particularly for Bordeaux. But come to think of it, even in Burgundy, they're blending. They're blending. Winemakers know, even inside a clos, they know better. There are better parts of the clos, and they're blending those together. They make them in different barrels. They don't always put all the barrels together for their Grand Cru or Premier Cru. And when you get to a village level, even a Premier Cru level, they're blending. So blending is everywhere. And the issue for us is, do we do we recognize blending as a valuable part of winemaking? And as Michel Rolland will tell you, though, it's 98% art and 2% science, so maybe that's why we don't take it so seriously. I also like what Michel Rolland very honestly says, which are wines are elaborated with the humble and crucial purpose of being sold. So you have to ask yourself, why is blending happening? But we don't really know much about, except for Rolland, we don't know much about the rock star blenders. And apparently the real rock star blender in Bordeaux is Eric Boissonnet. And I don't know how many people have heard of him. I've never met him, but he apparently works for almost 150 of the chateaux. And he and his father are the rock stars of blending in Bordeaux. And just putting this together made me more curious to learn more about blending. I did do a blending class with Andy Erickson once, and I really commend any of you to actually do some blending yourselves. Andy was the winemaker Screaming Eagle, and we did a blending class of 6 or 7 different wines he made, and we all tasted them separately. And then we made our own cuvee, and then he went around the room and evaluated them. And he said to me, "You love Bordeaux." And I said, "I do." And he said, "I could tell from your blend." And I said, "So what do you think?" He said, "You've made the best blend in the room." And I said, "Yeah, but that doesn't taste like your wine." He said, "Yeah, but that's not what my customers want. They don't want the wine you made. They want a wine that they perceive to be a wine from California with a different blend." So I think even a master blender, it does go back to what Rolland says is at the end of the day, they've got to sell wine. And if Andy Erickson's going to blend wine to his customer base, that's what he's going to do, even if he knows it's not the best blend he could possibly put together, whatever best is. But anyway, I just submit that blending is of equal standing with terroir. Moving on, I guess 2 other points on the parcels and blending is the problem in Bordeaux, I find, is that any of the great chateaux, they also know that they have subparcels in their terroir, which are better, really good, mediocre, or not so good, and they have no choice but to put them all together in the mix. They can take out, through triage, they can take out the really rotten or the substandard grapes, but they really can't totally avoid, but for economic reasons, mixing in mediocre grapes with great grapes. And I think it's got to be very frustrating. But Pichon Lalande cannot make a super premium wine because it's just going to diminish the value of the regular Pichon Lalande. And if the wineries are doing anything, it seems to me that they're doing what Eric Vogt wrote about several years ago in the Harvard Business Review. They're pushing a new wine down. Margaux put out the 3rd wine, and it's a really interesting article if you haven't read Eric's piece in the Harvard Business Review. There is a guy, a hedge fund guy, who has been looking at this and feels that winemaking in Bordeaux doesn't make sense because of this forced blending of quality, and he has secretly gone out and contracted for wines for grapes that a soil geologist that he spent 10 years with have identified parcels, and believe it or not, there are wineries that are willing to sell them their super premium grapes on a secret basis because they could use the money today to cover some overhead. And he's making a wine called SGC. I think it really stands for Secret Grand Cru. And we've had it in a couple of comparative tastings blind with some of the big names. And I tell you that these wines are really, really good. So I think there is something to, and that wine is a blended wine, but he's able to extract it from super premium grapes.
Are you blending appellations?
Yeah, so he'll just have a Pomerol or a Saint-Emilion, exactly. And now he's getting them from a bunch of different chateaux, but it's all by appellation. You have to agree to buy a case of each of his 6 wines, and it's about, it's a lot of money. It's about $800, $900 a bottle. But he throws some really good parties with it. But he's doing something quite interesting and quite controversial, and you can imagine the Bordelais are kind of quite concerned about him. They are also concerned about another fellow named Loic Pasquet. And Loic has become a little bit of a friend. He's a heretic. He went out and through rootstock that is still being preserved in Bordeaux for historical reasons, has gone out and made wines from pre-phylloxera vines like Tannant and others. And he's selling his wine for up to $4,000 a bottle in Asia based on it being truly original wine. And he'll contest that we don't even understand the taste of wine, because all the wine we've ever had all of our lives, and since the 1855, or since phylloxera, has been industrialized to again kind of move to our tastes. That if you look at what was in Château d'Isson before the 1855 classification and before phylloxera, it was 100% Tenon. It wasn't Cabernet and Merlot. And the wines taste definitely different, so it's very hard to say I like it more or less than something else. And he's been gone after legally by the French for taking European Union subsidies for what he's doing. He's won on appeal, but it's been a tough road for him. But he's trying to do something, I think, kind of unique and different as well. And these are some of the people that we don't hear about much in Bordeaux that I thought it would just be fun to share with you. But going back to the basics, what I was talking about, going back to tasting on a geosensory basis, I think it's really important as we put our baggage aside, our learned knowledge, our ego, and our desire not to offend somebody, to think about just the basic components of wine we're tasting. Just texture, consistency, sappiness, suppleness, exuberance and complexity, and a level of minerality. And maybe not get too laden down with all the words that you have. And this, at the end of the day, how do we taste these things? Well, there's been a ton of examination through the tongue, through the brain sensors, and maybe it's as simple as not asking too many questions, just understanding, just again letting it feel. And I'm no scientist, but I've looked at a ton of things like this, and I've been trying to figure out when they trashed the tongue sensor idea of sweetness and saltiness and bitterness, what's replaced it, what more understanding. And as far as I've been able to determine, there really isn't any more advanced understanding of what influences taste. But I think beyond the four components that have traditionally been understood in tasting, the fifth component is maybe the most valuable, because it goes to the beginning of my psychosensory perception, which is umami. And we all know about umami. It's that kind of concept of yumminess, right? And it's something that we feel. It's a sensory perception. It's described as savory. It's a little bit reminiscent, they say, of MSG, but not exactly the same. But at the end of the day, to me, umami makes you feel great, not just as you taste it, but as you absorb it in your body and maybe even in your mind. And there are other products like that we eat. They say mushrooms have a lot of umami, and bacon, they say, might have the most of all of umami. I would guess I'd have to start reducing things to calling certain wines comfort wines, et cetera. And going further on this point, and now I'm going to be a little heretical, I haven't found anything that talks about how wine really makes us feel, whether I get a better buzz off of Lafite than Latour, than Haut-Brion, or a Burgundy. And if you think about it, those taboo magazines that we weren't supposed to read right after we snuck a look at Playboy, called High Times. Well, what did they write about? They didn't write about the smell of marijuana or the taste of marijuana. It was all about the buzz of marijuana, the relative buzz of marijuana. Why is wine really any different than that? Why is it so driven by the front end and not at all attributable to the back end? Is it just considered so unintellectual to talk about that it's just something any wine critic would not approach because of the condemnation they'd receive for it? So really, to me, none of this is that simple. I think we're going to constantly fight between what we're told by our sommelier friends, what we know with the accrued knowledge we bring to the tasting. But at the end of the day, I would say to you, don't forget the basics. Try to, as you bring your baggage on your wine journey, pack light. Make sure your clothes inside are clean, well organized, folded. So if you're going to deal with them, at least try to keep them in order. And make sure that your primary focus is just on the basics, the sensory basics, to find the taste of place, and then really just to try to find the feeling wine gives you, that blend of intellectual pleasure plus the hedonistic pleasure that I think we all really love wine for. We just need to have the courage to admit it. Thank you very much. Oh, as an addendum, I do want to say that I tried to research on the web people who, is anyone willing to talk about the buzz of wine? And these idiots at ranker.com say that wine, which is of course fully fermented, has a rather high sugar content and makes your hangover worse, which makes no sense to me. And Dr. Vinny talking about a hedonistic wine and wine makes you feel that it must seem strange to refer to a wine in that way. So we have a long way to go, and maybe that'll be the source of my first wine book. Thank you.